All right. All right. It sure is. All right. Welcome back. Just wanted to turn her to say hi to the camera. So we are working on the koshas. Let's kind of dive into the koshas and review what Swami Chidatmananda gave us some insight on as he broke down the koshas for us in a pretty interesting way so that we can really resonate with it and really bite-sized nugget informations with some really sweet visuals. And so I present here the same visual that he presented for us with the Russian doll so that we can kind of dive into that a little bit more. And some pinpoints and some suggestions for you to write down and to keep kind of in the back of your mind, in the back burner there, is what Atman means, Atman being pure consciousness. And so when we look at the diagram, and when we looked at the diagram, I'm just going to pull out the whiteboard again, we looked at it in the sense of it being in a circular form. And so how that was there was a big circle, and then there was another circle and another circle, and then in the middle was Atman, right? And when we look at Atman, Atman is really the whiteboard, okay? It's everything around that makes up pure consciousness. And when we look at pure consciousness, we're connected to pure consciousness. We are one with all things. So having Atman be in the middle of the target really gives it a disservice, is what Swami was speaking about, because you really want to think about Atman as these 5 layers. The koshas are your pathway of ignorance, basically these 5 ignorant layers that kind of keep us from experiencing Atman. So that would be kind of where that boundary comes in. But then when we start to break down the walls and dismantle these layers, that's when we begin to find Atman in the white space around us. That's when we get to connect to pure consciousness and to oneness of all things, right? And so instead of taking it into the perspective of having that bullseye as Atman and that bullseye as being oneness with all things, let's look at it from a different perspective. And so we touched on very briefly the Taittiriya Upanishads written by Shankara and Shankaracharya, and he really dissects it in more of this scholar type of commentary in the Upanishad in respect to the koshas. Worth checking out, but I'm going to just dissect it for us here. So when we look at the different sheaths, we start with the outermost sheath, and this is known as Anamaya Kosha. Anamaya-kosha is the food sheath. It's the layer of how we nourish ourselves, what we're putting in to this body. What are we taking in food-wise? What are we taking in musically? The external. And what are we putting into that? It's the furthest away from the Atman layer. It's the furthest away from the encompassment of all things. So it's the one that we want to work through first on breaking down and dissolving. And each of the layers is a goal to really break down these layers of ignorance so that we can really connect to pure consciousness or oneness, or in layman terms, connecting to nature. When we wake up at between 3 and 5 a.m., we're connecting to source. It's source's way of awakening us to the messages that we want to receive. Anamaya-kosha is the furthest from it. It doesn't allow us to receive those messages because we're blocked by self-imposed limitations and what we're putting in. If we're putting in a lot of negativity, if we're putting in a lot of I can't and I don't and I cannot want to and all the things, then we are disattaching ourselves, disassociating ourselves from pure consciousness or from our higher purpose or our higher self. We're creating a boundary and limiting ourselves from moving forward. So instead, what we're doing is, if we have this big circle, this big layer, we are creating kind of a block, a wall for ourselves to go any further, in to explore any other layers that we have, because we can't, because we don't want to, because we're afraid to, because I don't want to eat that, because I don't want to try that. And so if we want to maybe change the idea, change the mindset of what we're nourishing ourselves with, then that creates an opening for us to now explore this next layer, which is known as our Pranamaya Kosha, our energy sheath. So the food and the intake, that which we put into our bodies, that which nourishes us, creates energy. That energy is what stimulates us and prepares us and fuels us and fires us up to take on this new mental capacity. When we're energized, we are filled with efforts. We're filled with prana, with life force. Prana energy then moves through this body and gives us this space to now open up into areas where we're taking negative energy and repurposing it into positive energy. We're fueling it into art. We're fueling it into creativity, into movement. We're fueling it into something that's going to create abundance from what we've been putting into our bodies and nourishing ourselves with, and then utilizing what we've nourished to energize ourselves with that. And that energy is then going to trigger and stimulate a new pathway for us to enter into Vijnamaya Kosha. In this mental capacity, I'm sorry, I take that back, not Vijnamaya Kosha, Manamaya Kosha. When we take that energy into the mental state of our being and we progress into this area of embodiment. Here in the mind sheath is where we are creating new habits and new patterns that are going to pave the way, the pathway into creating an avenue of conscious thought patterns that eliminate the breakdown of the limiting beliefs, the I can'ts, I should nots, I will never, can't amount to, this pushback, these blockages, these walls that we create, right? So if we're nourishing ourselves with the right types of food and the right types of holistic healing and the right type of body work, then we're going to be able to then take that energy and repurpose it and refuel it and renew it into something that's going to create a positive mindset, a new change of mood. And that's the type of energy that we utilize in Manamaya Kosha when we create a new abundant mindset. When we change our mind, we change our thoughts, we change our words, we change our well-being, we change how we intake, and it leads us into our next path, our next step. When we come into the changing of our mindset, we start to break down these conditioned patterns and beliefs, and we create a new opening for our next layer. And that next layer then takes us into Vijnamaya Kosha. Vijnamaya Kosha is our intellect sheath. This is the space of acknowledging what is and what isn't. We acknowledge the ripples, but we see the truth. This is where we bring back in our chitti vrittis, or the monkey mind. This is the space, again, the intellect, the wisdom layer, where we see past the mundane, where we're able to acknowledge what is real versus the unreal or the illusion or the Maya. This is the space that's preparing us, or where we would be coming into that third eye chakra area. This is the area in the Nadic channel, or in the yoga 8 limbs of yoga, where we are now preparing ourselves into that third eye, into the space of clairvoyance, into the wisdom, where we're taking in, we're receiving, we're repurposing the energy, we're refueling that nourishment, and we're acknowledging that we are pure consciousness, that we are one with all things, that we embody the same vibrational energy from the food that we eat, from the plants that are around us, the air that we breathe, the water that's flowing and cleansing and purifying us, all things become oneness in the space of the mind's intellect. We become more conscious of Atman, which then leads us to Atman. And although Atman might be itty bitty, Anandamaya Kosha is where we discover Atman. Anandamaya Kosha, now check it out. If you listen closely, there's one more doll inside. Anandamaya Kosha is the atom. If you think of Atman, think of the word atom, right? The smallest particle of being, of matter, the smallest particle that encompasses all things. This tiny seedling or this tiny itty bitty kosha is all things, is oneness, is the white board, is Atman. This little seed of nourishment takes on all things. From the tiniest seed, the biggest tree grows, right? And from there is pure consciousness, where we're not affected by what happened yesterday or what's going to happen tomorrow, because we're wise enough to know that we're not attached to those thoughts, that we are not our thoughts, that we are not even our bodies. We are spiritual beings living human experiences. And when we start to recognize that being, that soul self, that light within ourselves, this light will then grow and start to dismantle the layers that are holding it confined, that is restricting it. Atman creates the awareness from within. Atman, if you think about it, is Manipura chakra. It's the willpower and the intention. It's the healing from within. Atman grows from within the body as we are all one with divine source. Divine source is one with us. When we chant, we stimulate the vibrations to connect to the higher source. Atman living in this tiny itty bitty little body, thinking about it in a sense of ourselves. We are the itty bitty tiny little body living in the world, the globe, this abundant state or country. We are one being that is embodied by source. We are a living vessel that breaks down each of these koshas through our living and daily experiences of how we nourish ourselves, of how we take on that energy and repurpose it, of how we think and change our mindset and utilize this information, of how we intellectually guide others, consciously educating and ourselves, and connecting to all things by seeing with our eye. We're seeing with our mind and not with our eyes. This takes us in through each step, each gradient level of connecting to source. No one said it's going to be easy, but it's part of this process. It is all pervasive. It is all things. Now let's pop down to our notes. We go over the 5 levels of confusion through these beautiful dolls that we see here. The wrong conclusions that we make of ourselves prevent us, so this creates that block again, prevents us from seeing our true self that's within, our true self that lies within. So when we find our true selves through the practice of dismantling the 5 layers, we find ourselves connected to Atman, or our higher purpose, our true self. We strip away these koshas and these erroneous notions around us, and we connect to that which is of pure and oneness. We become overly identified with our roles. So this is something I want us to really pay attention to, being overly identified with our roles. So for example, I may be overly identified as the role of a yoga teacher. So if I was to eat a chicken sandwich, I would probably be, oh my gosh, she just ate chicken. She is not practicing ahimsa, and she's not a yoga teacher because she's not vegan or vegetarian or what have you. And so when I'm associated with a role or an identity, and so my behavior is then based on that identity, or what I'm nourishing myself with is based on that identity, I'm also taking on the problems of that identity. I'm taking on the problems of the yoga teacher. I'm taking on the problems of a business owner. I'm taking on the problems of a mother. I'm taking on the problems of a father. I'm taking on the problems of whatever, when I identify myself with that role. When I identify with myself with that role and I don't disassociate, so okay, I'm a yoga teacher today, I'm a yoga teacher right now, but when I'm done with this series, or when I'm done with this teaching or this class or what have you, I'm Christina, I'm myself, I am one with nature. I go outside and kayak or skateboard, or I commune with nature outside myself. I'm not doing yoga, I'm doing something else that allows me to just express myself however I want to be, without being attached or identified to any one thing. I'm not attaching myself to the role of being a vegan or a vegetarian or a pescatarian or whatever these labels are. I am allowing myself to just be whatever my body wants and is asking for in that time, and whatever it needs, the higher self needs, not what necessarily I want, but it's about what I need. And so when we allow ourselves to not be attached to what happened at work or what happened at home, and we give ourselves the space to know that the soul is timeless. If we go through a horrible breakup after being with that person for 10 or 15 years, we know that for the soul, 10 or 15 years is a second compared to the soul self of timeless expansion. We don't put a time frame on the soul. We don't put a time frame on oneness or Atman or Brahma. We put a time frame on the human self. And so therefore, when we are fixated on having to do and has to be done and I need to do, then we're limiting ourselves from giving ourselves the permission to fully be at one and going with truly the flow. Instead of changing that vocabulary and saying, I choose to, as opposed to I have to. When you choose to do something, you're choosing to create a new path to allow yourself this space of progression so that you can grow. So we don't want to be attached to these identities, okay? Whatever we identify with ourselves becomes the source of our suffering. We learn this from the Four Noble Truths, and those Four Noble Truths going through the cessation of suffering, life is suffering, Duhkka, and then overcoming Duhkka. We free from the identification by creating this pure consciousness, and then knowing that we're not affected by anything once we are aware that we are in pure consciousness. Once we're aware that we are in pure consciousness, we have nothing else to worry about. I'm going to introduce you to my friend Illy. He's going to be in one of our videos that you're going to see next here. And Illy Stovall is an incredible yoga meditator. He is a practitioner. He's a baseball player. He's a coach. He is an incredible soul. And honestly, I don't think he's human. And he is going to lead us through a really insightful meditation and kind of give us some insight of how he is just oneness with all things and this timelessness that he speaks about. And he really breaks down the koshas in a very, very layman term way for us to experience a meditation that brings this to fruition. So it's really sweet, and we're going to go through that in just a moment. So the goal is to remove our identity to each of these koshas. We don't want to be very refined with them. We don't want to be confined to this is where I'm at right now, and I am this Anamaya-kosha, and I'm only eating this and taking in that. We want to be able to encompass all things and be able to take in to all of our koshas, removing each layer one at a time through this guided meditation, or through the sense of awareness of letting go of that which no longer serves us, and being able to allow each of these koshas, each of these layers, each of these sheaths, to then allow ourselves to progress into Atman, or oneness, into being connected to all things, knowing that at the core of ourself, at the very root of ourselves, is pure consciousness. Even though we're going through all of life's experiences on the outside through these dolls, knowing that within ourselves, we are connected to all things, and we know in our pure consciousness that everything that's going on around us is temporal and it will not last forever. And these are just learning experiences that are going to help us progress to our next level of consciousness. I hope this helps. And if you have any questions, as always, we'll review them on our live call and we'll discuss those then. Take a look at the video that's coming up next. It's going to be one of our meditations with Ili Stovall. You can find a bunch more of those on the members only site, where we have a couple more videos with him and about 4 or 5 videos with Ili going through a series of tilling the soil of our soul, which is a meditation process that really gets us grounded and connected to the earth. So I'll see you then. Talk to you soon. Much love and namaste.